It was just another day for Captain James Bennett. As the captain of an international flight, he was no stranger to long hours and the responsibility that came with leading a plane full of passengers. But today, something unexpected was about to happen. James had arrived early at the airport, as usual, preparing for the long flight ahead. He had been working as a pilot for over a decade, always taking pride in his job. He had spent countless hours in the cockpit, calmly overseeing every detail of his flights, always ready to ensure everything went smoothly. This particular flight was a routine one. He would be flying a group of passengers from New York to Los Angeles. After completing his pre-flight check, James made his way to the gate and boarded the plane. He was tired but focused, eager to settle into his seat and begin the journey. He walked down the narrow aisle, past rows of passengers, who were still settling in and finding their seats. His first-class seat, which had been reserved for him as the captain of the flight, was in the front of the plane. It was a comfortable spot, offering a quiet place to relax before he started his duties. But as he reached his seat, something unusual happened. A flight attendant approached him with a puzzled look on her face. She was young, probably in her 20s, and looked like she was still learning the ropes of her job. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely, "but I'm afraid you'll have to move. This seat is reserved for a first-class passenger, and it appears you are in the wrong seat." James blinked in confusion. He had never experienced anything like this before. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat," he said calmly, showing her his boarding pass. The seat had been assigned to him as part of his role as the captain of the flight. The flight attendant didn't seem to understand. "I'm sorry, sir, but you'll need to find another seat," she insisted, glancing at the seating chart in her hand. "This seat is for a higher priority passenger." James was taken aback. He had dealt with delays, turbulence, and emergency situations in his career, but never had he been questioned like this before. Still, he remained calm. "I am the pilot of this flight," he said, pointing to his uniform. "This seat is for me." The flight attendant looked at him, clearly confused. She wasn't used to seeing pilots in first class. Perhaps she hadn't realized that the captain was not just another passenger. But James didn't let the situation escalate. Instead, he stood his ground politely but firmly. He wasn't angry, but it was clear that this misunderstanding needed to be resolved quickly. As the flight attendant hesitated, another staff member, a senior attendant, walked by and stopped. She glanced at the seating chart, then at James, and immediately seemed to understand. However, instead of clearing up the confusion, she gave James a tight smile and said, "Sir, you'll need to move. The seat is reserved." It was then that James realized something was happening here. This wasn't just a mix-up, it was something more. He had dealt with many passengers, many different people in his time as a pilot, but the way they were treating him felt off. He sighed, trying to keep his patience. "This seat is mine," he said again, looking at both flight attendants. "I am the captain." Now his words began to sink in. They finally stopped, looking at each other, realizing their mistake. The tension in the air was thick, and James could see the confusion on their faces as they tried to process the situation. But he didn't raise his voice or act angry. Instead, he waited, knowing the next few moments would be crucial in turning things around. As the flight attendant stood there, frozen in surprise, James remained calm. The situation was unusual, but he wasn't one to lose his composure easily. He knew this wasn't a simple misunderstanding anymore. Something about the way they were acting made it clear that they hadn't fully realized who he was. James had flown thousands of miles and had a wealth of experience as a captain, but this was a first for him. He had never been asked to move from his own seat. The younger flight attendant looked at him with confusion. "Sir, I really don't mean to be rude, but this seat is for a first-class passenger. You'll need to find your assigned seat." James could see the stress in her eyes. She was probably just following orders, unsure of how to handle the situation. But this wasn't the way it should be. As a professional, he understood that these things happen, But it didn't change the fact that he was being treated differently than any other first-class passenger. "Look," James said, his voice firm yet friendly, "I understand that you have a job to do. But I'm the pilot of this flight, and this seat was assigned to me. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm simply asking you to understand that this is my seat." There was a moment of silence. The younger flight attendant was still standing there, not sure how to respond. It wasn't every day that a pilot was questioned about his seat. She didn't know what to do. That's when the senior attendant, who had been watching from a distance, finally spoke up. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice calm but with an underlying tension. James turned to her and explained again, "I'm the captain of this flight, and this seat is mine. I believe there's been a misunderstanding." The senior flight attendant's eyes widened, and a look of realization passed over her face. She took a step back and glanced at the younger attendant, then at James. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't realize," she started to say, but James interrupted her before she could finish. "It's all right," he replied, still keeping his cool. "I know this isn't intentional. I just want to make sure we clear this up. There's no need for any more confusion." His words were calm and composed, but his tone carried the strength of someone who wasn't going to let this mistake slide. The senior attendant nodded, now understanding the mistake. "Thank you for your patience, Captain. Please take your seat." But James didn't sit down immediately. He paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the area. He could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just about a seat assignment anymore. This was about respect. James had earned his position over many years, and he wasn't going to let anyone undermine that, even if it was unintentional. Before he sat down, he looked at both flight attendants and spoke again, this time with a quiet authority. "I understand that mistakes happen, but let's make sure this doesn't happen again. The next time a captain boards a plane, I would expect the staff to understand who they are and why they're here." His words weren't harsh, but they carried the weight of experience. The senior flight attendant nodded again, and the younger attendant, though still a bit uncomfortable, finally stepped aside. As James settled into his seat, the atmosphere around him started to shift. The passengers nearby had been watching, some unaware of what had happened, and others now starting to understand the situation. James had handled the mix-up with professionalism and leadership, showing that a calm demeanor and clear communication could make all the difference in a tense situation. It was clear now that this wasn't just another day on the job. James had subtly taught the crew a valuable lesson, one they wouldn't forget. As James settled into his seat, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of calm wash over him. The tension that had built up in the last few minutes slowly started to fade. He had handled the situation well, but something still felt off. The crew had made a mistake, yes, but it seemed like it wasn't just about the seat assignment anymore. There was something deeper at play. As he glanced around the cabin, James could see passengers whispering to each other, some looking toward him, others still engrossed in their own conversations. The air had shifted. People had noticed what had happened. He wasn't just a passenger here, he was the captain. And somehow, in the eyes of the flight crew, that hadn't been clear to them until just now. The flight attendants moved away to speak with the senior staff. James knew this wasn't over yet. He was sure they would come back to apologize, but the situation wasn't something he could easily forget. As a pilot, he had worked hard to reach his position, facing many challenges and overcoming obstacles along the way. To be mistaken for just another passenger was a humbling experience, but it was also a reminder that respect and understanding needed to go both ways. About 10 minutes passed, and the plane began to fill up with the usual noise. The rustling of luggage, the announcements, and the soft murmurs of passengers settling in. But then, just as James was about to close his eyes and relax, the senior flight attendant returned to his seat. She walked toward him with a serious but apologetic expression on her face. Behind her, a man in a suit, presumably someone from the airline's higher ranks, followed closely. "Captain Bennett, The senior attendant said, her voice much more respectful this time. "I am so sorry for the confusion earlier. There was a mix-up, and I want to assure you that this won't happen again." James nodded, giving her a small smile. He wasn't looking for an apology, but it was good to know that the situation was being handled properly. He had no desire to make things more difficult for anyone, especially not the flight crew. They were just doing their jobs. The man in the suit stepped forward and extended his hand. "Captain, I'm the flight supervisor. I want to personally apologize for the misunderstanding. We value your service, and we will make sure this situation is addressed with the rest of the crew." James shook the supervisor's hand firmly. "I appreciate that," he said. "Mistakes happen, but it's important to make sure we learn from them. I understand that this may not have been intentional, but the next time a captain boards, there should be no confusion." The supervisor nodded, looking a bit uncomfortable. "Absolutely, Captain. Thank you for your understanding. We'll make sure it's handled differently in the future." James gave a reassuring smile. "It's all right. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. I'm here to do my job, and I expect the same from everyone else." As the conversation wrapped up, the supervisor and the senior flight attendant turned to leave, their steps now more measured, more respectful. They had realized the gravity of the mistake, and James had handled it with a grace that spoke volumes about his leadership. The plane was about to take off, and the crew was in motion again, preparing for departure. But as James looked out the window, he couldn't help but reflect on the events of the last few minutes. He had proven that leadership didn't always have to be loud or confrontational. Sometimes it was simply about standing firm, staying calm, and making sure the right message was communicated. James had taken charge of the situation, and now the flight could finally proceed smoothly, just as it should. As the plane began its climb into the sky, the hum of the engines became a calming background to the soft chatter of passengers. James leaned back in his seat, still reflecting on what had just happened. The flight was moving smoothly now, and everything seemed to be in order. The crew had apologized and made their intentions clear, but deep down, James couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to change, not just for him, but for the entire airline. It wasn't just about a seat assignment, it was about respect. As the captain, he had earned his place on that plane, not just because of his title, but because of the years of experience, training, and leadership he had put in. To be mistaken for a simple passenger was one thing, but to be treated as though his position wasn't important was something else entirely. The flight attendants had returned to their posts after the apology, but the atmosphere was different now. They seemed quieter, perhaps a little more thoughtful, as if they were processing the situation and what they had learned. James could see that they were trying to figure out how to move forward. It was clear that they didn't want any more misunderstandings to happen. A few moments later, the senior flight attendant came back to check on James. She stood by his seat, looking a little hesitant but sincere. "Captain, I wanted to thank you again for handling everything so calmly. I've been thinking about what happened earlier, and I realize I could have handled the situation differently." James smiled, appreciating her honesty. "I understand," he said. "It's easy to make mistakes, especially when there's confusion. The important thing is that we learn from it." She nodded, looking relieved that James wasn't holding any hard feelings. "I've been with the airline for several years, and I'd never seen anything like this before. We've had small mix-ups, but nothing like this. I'm really sorry for how it all went down." "It's all right," James reassured her. "I'm sure you didn't mean any harm. The important thing is to address things when they happen and to make sure everyone is on the same page. We all have a role to play, and that's what makes things work smoothly." The senior flight attendant nodded again, clearly grateful for his understanding. "I'll be talking to the crew about how to handle things better in the future. We'll make sure everyone knows what to expect when a captain boards." James could tell she was genuinely trying to make things right. He appreciated that she wasn't just brushing it off. This was a learning moment, not just for the crew, but for the entire airline. As the flight continued, James noticed small changes in the way the flight attendants interacted with him. They were more attentive, but in a respectful way, as if they were more aware of their roles and the importance of their positions. James didn't need extra attention, but it was nice to feel respected, especially after the earlier misunderstanding. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, the atmosphere had settled into a smooth rhythm. The passengers were comfortable, the crew was working well together, and James felt at peace, knowing that the issue had been resolved. The flight was going to be just another successful trip, thanks to everyone doing their part. In the end, the experience had been more than just a moment of frustration. It had been a turning point. The crew had learned a valuable lesson about respect, leadership, and the importance of understanding each other's roles. And James had shown, once again, that true leadership wasn't about demanding respect, but about earning it with calm and thoughtful action. As the hours passed and the plane soared through the sky, James sat back in his seat, feeling the weight of the earlier events slowly lifting. The crew had apologized, and the issue seemed to be settled. But as a leader, he knew this wasn't just about moving past an uncomfortable moment. It was about ensuring that the situation would never repeat itself. He understood that this was an opportunity for the airline to improve, not just for him, but for everyone involved. It was during the mid-flight service when James noticed something shift. The senior flight attendant, who had apologized earlier, walked past him again. This time, her movements were different, more measured, more mindful. She stopped for a brief moment, making eye contact with him. "Captain Bennett," she began, her voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened earlier, and I wanted to thank you again for being so understanding." James gave her a polite nod. "No problem. I know mistakes happen. The important thing is that we work together to fix them." The flight attendant smiled, clearly relieved. "I spoke with the rest of the crew, and we're all on the same page now. We're making sure that something like this doesn't happen again." James appreciated hearing this. He wasn't looking for an apology anymore, but he wanted to know that the crew understood what had gone wrong and how to prevent it in the future. He knew that small errors could spiral out of control if they weren't handled correctly, and he was glad the crew was taking it seriously. "There's a lot to learn from these situations," James continued, his tone calm but firm. "The key is making sure everyone knows their role and everyone respects each other's position. It's the only way we'll be able to move forward without issues." The flight attendant nodded thoughtfully. "You're absolutely right. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day rush of everything, but we can't forget the bigger picture. We need to be aware of how important every single person is on the team, passenger or crew." James smiled, impressed by her insight. She had clearly taken the situation to heart and was committed to making sure it didn't happen again. This kind of attitude was what made a real difference in a professional environment. People weren't just cogs in a machine. They were integral parts of a team, and everyone needed to recognize that. As the flight continued, James noticed that the rest of the crew seemed to be more aware of their actions. They were more attentive and careful in their duties, and James could sense a shift in their attitudes. It wasn't just about following orders. It was about taking pride in their work and understanding the importance of what they did. Around an hour later, the senior flight attendant returned, this time with a few small but important changes. "Captain," she said, "I just wanted to let you know that we've made some adjustments in the cabin to prevent this from happening again. We've put up new signs and reminders for the crew, and I'll personally make sure everyone knows the procedures for handling these kinds of situations." James felt a sense of relief. It was clear that the airline was taking the issue seriously. "I'm glad to hear that," he replied. "It's not just about this one incident. It's about the bigger picture. I appreciate you and the crew being open to making changes." The flight attendant smiled. "Thank you for your patience, Captain. It's not easy to handle situations like this, but your calmness and leadership really helped." As she walked away, James felt a sense of pride. The situation had been handled not with anger, but with understanding and clear communication. And now, thanks to everyone's efforts, the issue had been addressed, and the flight was continuing without any further interruptions. The journey was far from over, but James knew that this experience had made the crew stronger. They had learned valuable lessons, not just about respect, but about teamwork and leadership. It wasn't always easy to address difficult situations, but when done with care, it could lead to growth and improvement for everyone involved. As the flight continued its journey across the sky, James felt a renewed sense of calm. The turbulence of the earlier misunderstanding had passed, and the crew was now working together smoothly. But there was something more that lingered in the air, an unspoken awareness. The passengers, some of whom had witnessed the entire interaction, were beginning to talk quietly among themselves. James could feel their eyes on him every now and then. He wasn't uncomfortable, but it was clear that people had noticed what had happened. It wasn't every day that a flight attendant would question the captain's seat assignment. Passengers, especially those in first class, were now glancing at him with curiosity. Some had even overheard the conversation between the crew and James. He didn't mind. If anything, he felt proud that he had handled the situation with grace and professionalism. He didn't want to be the center of attention, but if his actions could lead to a positive change in how things were done, then he was glad for it. Soon enough, a few passengers began to approach him. They weren't aggressive or upset, but they clearly had questions about what had happened. One man, in his late 40s, dressed in a business suit, leaned over as the flight attendant was passing by. "Captain," he said, his voice respectful but filled with curiosity. "I just wanted to say that I admired how you handled that situation. I saw what happened, and I can tell that you've got a lot of class. It wasn't easy, but you kept your cool." James smiled politely, grateful for the compliment. "Thank you, sir. I just did what was necessary. It's important to remain calm, even when things aren't going as planned." The man nodded, seemingly reassured by the captain's calm demeanor. "That's the kind of leadership we need more of. A lot of people would have blown up in that situation, but you handled it like a professional. It's a reminder that things don't always go smoothly, but how we deal with them matters the most." James appreciated the sentiment. "I agree," he replied, glancing around at the other passengers. "It's not just about doing the job. It's about doing it well, no matter what comes your way." As the conversation ended, James noticed a few other passengers exchanging smiles and nods in his direction. It was clear that many had witnessed the exchange and were impressed by his handling of the situation. There was no anger, no shouting, just calm, respectful communication, and it seemed that people respected him for it. A few minutes later, another passenger, a woman in her 30s, approached James. She had been sitting in one of the first-class seats, watching the entire scene unfold. "Captain, I just wanted to say that I was really impressed with how you dealt with everything. It was an unfortunate situation, but you handled it with so much poise." James thanked her graciously. "I appreciate your kind words. It wasn't the ideal situation, but it's important to stay calm and solve things the right way." The woman smiled, clearly reassured. "I think we all could learn a thing or two from you. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the moment, but you showed everyone that a little patience and understanding go a long way." James felt a sense of pride in her words. While the situation had been stressful at first, it had turned into something far more positive. He hadn't just diffused the situation. He had made an impact on those around him. His ability to stay calm in the face of a challenge had served as a reminder that leadership wasn't about shouting orders or demanding respect. It was about earning it with thoughtful actions and clear communication. As the plane cruised smoothly through the sky, James reflected on the power of a single moment. Sometimes, the way we handle difficult situations can speak louder than anything else, and it was clear that this moment was going to stay with everyone on board, passengers and crew alike, for a long time. As the flight continued its steady course, James sat back in his seat, his mind reflecting on the events of the day. The turbulence had passed, both literally and figuratively. The crew had learned from their mistake, and the passengers were settling in, seemingly at ease. Yet James couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the incident than just a simple misunderstanding. It had been a turning point, not just for the crew, but for him as well. He looked out of the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds beneath him. It was moments like these that reminded him why he loved being a pilot. There was something peaceful about the sky, something that made everything else seem smaller. Up here, the issues of the world below seemed distant, almost insignificant. But James knew better. Even in the peaceful sky, things could go wrong. But it was how you handled those moments that defined who you were. James had spent many years working his way up to the captain's seat. It hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, times when he wasn't sure if he was good enough, when the weight of responsibility felt too heavy. But he had never given up. Every challenge had shaped him into the leader he was today. And while he loved the calm of flying, he had come to realize that leadership was not just about staying calm in the cockpit. It was about staying composed in every situation, whether on the ground or in the air. As he thought about the flight crew, he felt a sense of pride. They had made a mistake, yes, but they had taken responsibility for it. They had learned from it and were already making changes to ensure it wouldn't happen again. That was what leadership was all about: learning, growing, and improving together. It wasn't just about being in charge. It was about being a part of something bigger than yourself. James knew that his role as captain was more than just a title. It was a responsibility to the people in the cabin, to the crew, and to everyone who trusted him to get them safely from one place to another. But today, he had learned something valuable. Leadership wasn't just about directing others. It was about setting an example. It was about showing others that you could face challenges with grace and calm, even when things weren't going as planned. The events earlier in the day had been an eye-opener for him. He had shown the crew what it meant to handle a difficult situation without losing his composure. It wasn't about demanding respect. It was about earning it with every action, every word, and every decision. He had faced a challenge, and instead of reacting with anger or frustration, he had taken control of the situation calmly and respectfully. James smiled to himself, feeling a quiet sense of pride. The crew had seen how he had handled the misunderstanding, and he hoped they would carry that lesson with them. It wasn't just about doing the job. It was about doing it with integrity, respect, and understanding. As the flight continued on its journey, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just the captain of a plane. He was a leader, a teacher, and a guide. And with every flight, he had the opportunity to make a difference, not just in the lives of those on board, but in his own life as well. The journey wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about the lessons learned along the way. As the flight began its descent toward its destination, James felt a sense of calm wash over him. The challenges of the day were behind him, but he knew that the impact of the events would linger long after the plane had landed. It wasn't just about a seat mix-up or a simple misunderstanding. It was about something deeper, something that touched on the core of leadership, respect, and how people handle difficult situations. The plane was now nearing its final approach, and the crew was busy preparing for landing. James was keeping an eye on everything, ensuring that every detail was in place. But his mind wasn't just focused on the technicalities of the flight. He was thinking about the crew, the passengers, and the lessons that had been learned. Today had been a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone on board. As the plane gently descended, James glanced over at the flight attendants. He could see that they were more attentive, more focused. They were working together seamlessly, a far cry from the awkwardness they had felt earlier. There was a quiet confidence in the way they moved now, and James couldn't help but feel proud. They had grown over the course of the flight, and it was clear that they were becoming stronger as a team. It wasn't just about the actions that had taken place earlier. It was about the way the crew had handled the situation afterward. They had recognized their mistake, taken responsibility, and worked to make sure it didn't happen again. That was the kind of leadership James admired. It wasn't about pointing fingers or getting upset. It was about learning, adapting, and moving forward together. As the flight neared its destination, James received a message from the airline's supervisor. The message was brief but clear. The company was aware of the situation and appreciated how it had been handled. They were taking steps to make sure that all staff, from the ground crew to the flight attendants, were better trained to understand the role of the captain and to ensure that similar incidents didn't occur in the future. The supervisor expressed their gratitude for James's professionalism and leadership. James felt a quiet satisfaction. His calm approach had made a difference, not just in the moment, but in a larger picture. The airline was taking the necessary steps to improve, and the crew had learned valuable lessons. He wasn't looking for recognition, but it felt good to know that his actions had sparked change. As the plane touched down smoothly and came to a stop at the gate, James felt a sense of accomplishment. The flight was over, but the impact of the day's events would stay with him. It wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about the moments in between, the interactions with others, and the lessons that were learned along the way. The passengers disembarked, some offering smiles or nods of appreciation as they passed by the cockpit. James greeted them with his usual polite smile, but inside, he felt a sense of pride. This flight had been different. It had been a chance to show what true leadership looked like, and while he knew there would always be more challenges to face in the future, today had reminded him of the power of calm, respectful leadership in even the most unexpected of situations. As the last passenger exited the plane, James looked around at the crew. They had learned, grown, and adapted. And in that moment, James knew that the lessons of the day had made an impact, both on them and on him. It had been a difficult moment, but it had ended with something positive, something that would continue to influence everyone involved for a long time to come. As the plane pulled into the gate and the engines powered down, James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few hours lifting. The journey had come to an end, and though the flight had been routine in many ways, it had also been anything but ordinary. The mix-up over the seat, the tension, the misunderstandings, it had all felt like a challenge. But in the end, it had turned into something more meaningful. James stood up from his seat, ready to leave the cockpit and join the rest of the crew as they prepared to disembark. The flight attendants, who had been so flustered earlier, now looked confident and composed. They exchanged smiles and nods, their interactions smoother than ever before. They had learned something important during the flight. It wasn't just about the mix-up. It was about how they handled it, how they responded to the situation and made it right. The lessons were clear. Professionalism, communication, and respect were the foundations of good teamwork. As James walked down the aisle, a few passengers, including some who had witnessed the earlier events, gave him nods of approval. One woman, who had been sitting near the front, stopped him to offer a few words. "Captain," she said warmly, "I just wanted to thank you for handling everything so well. It's not easy when things go wrong, but you made it look effortless." James smiled politely. "Thank you. I just did what needed to be done. It's important to stay calm and deal with things in a respectful way." The woman nodded, clearly impressed. "That's exactly it. You showed us all how to keep our heads in a tough situation. You turned it into a lesson for everyone." James felt a sense of pride. It wasn't just about the flight or the job. It was about showing those around him the power of calm leadership. Sometimes it wasn't the big moments that defined a person. It was how they handled the small, unexpected challenges that came their way. And in this case, he had shown the crew and the passengers the value of taking responsibility, staying composed, and working together. As James made his way to the crew's area, he was met with nods of respect from the flight attendants and even some of the other staff members. They had seen how the situation had unfolded and how James had handled it with professionalism and authority. The senior flight attendant approached him, her face filled with appreciation. "Captain, I just wanted to thank you again for your patience today. You've taught us all something really important. I know I'll be carrying those lessons forward." James gave her a nod of acknowledgement. I'm glad we were able to work through it together. It wasn't about what happened. It was about how we responded. That's what matters most." As the crew finished their final duties and the passengers began to exit, James took a moment to reflect on the flight. It had been more than just another trip. It had been a turning point for everyone involved. The crew had learned, the passengers had seen leadership in action, and James had reinforced his belief in the power of calm, respectful communication. Walking off the plane, James felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The incident had been resolved, and the crew was stronger for it. As he headed toward the crew lounge, he knew that the impact of the day would extend far beyond this flight. The lessons learned today would carry forward, not just for the crew, but for anyone who had witnessed the power of thoughtful, composed leadership. In the end, James realized that the true legacy of this flight wasn't about the seat mix-up or the initial misunderstanding. It was about the change that had happened afterward. The growth, the understanding, and the unity that came from a simple act of leadership. That, he thought, was what truly mattered. And that was a lesson that would last far longer than any flight.